Jonathan's story begins in a way that few would expect. He was not born into ministry, nor was he raised with an unshakable certainty that he would one day become a voice for God. His journey started with questions, doubts, and a constant search for truth. In his early years, he wrestled with the same struggles that many people carry: the meaning of life, the weight of purpose, and the silence that often meets our prayers. But within that restlessness was the seed of a calling that would later grow into something extraordinary. He often described his younger self as someone who was curious but distant, aware of the possibility of God, yet uncertain of his reality. Some around him lived with firm conviction, but Jonathan hesitated to give himself fully. He felt the pull of something greater, yet the push of doubt seemed just as strong. This tension became the foundation for the way God would later reveal himself in Jonathan's life. The turning point was not a dramatic vision, nor was it a grand moment in a cathedral. It was subtle, unexpected, and, at least at first, ordinary. Jonathan found himself repeatedly in situations where he should not have walked away unharmed. Car accidents, close calls, and strange moments of escape filled his story. Each time, he shrugged it off as luck, but somewhere inside he began to wonder whether he was being preserved for something more. One evening, sitting alone, he began to reflect on those escapes. Why was his life spared when so many others faced tragedy? Why was he given another chance again and again? That night, a thought emerged so clearly it startled him. "You are being saved for a reason." He could not explain where the words came from. They were not shouted aloud, but they reverberated in his spirit as if spoken directly into his heart. Still, he resisted. The idea of giving his life to God meant surrender, and surrender felt like losing. He wanted to write his own story, not hand the pen over to someone else. But the more he tried to pull away, the more unexplainable events seemed to surround him. He would meet strangers who spoke words that felt almost prophetic, or he would stumble across scripture that seemed to address his life with uncanny precision. The strangest moment came during a casual outing with friends. A man he had never met approached him, looked him in the eye, and said something Jonathan would never forget. "God has chosen you. You may not believe it yet, but He will show you." Jonathan froze. He wanted to dismiss it, but deep inside he felt the truth pressing against his reluctance. Time passed, but the sense of being pursued by God grew stronger. Eventually, Jonathan made a bargain. If God was real, he would have to prove it beyond doubt. If God wanted his life, then he would need to show it unmistakably. This was not rebellion as much as desperation. He did not want to build his faith on imagination. That very week, a sequence of events unfolded that Jonathan could never explain naturally. A job opportunity fell through, only to be replaced by one that brought him face to face with people who challenged him to consider Scripture seriously. A near accident that should have ended in disaster left him miraculously unharmed. And then came a conversation with a mentor figure who, without knowing Jonathan's inner struggle, spoke directly to the bargain he had made with God. The words cut through every layer of resistance. "You cannot make deals with the one who already holds your life. You have been spared because he has marked you. Stop running." Jonathan's defenses crumbled. The weight of all those years, all the escapes, all the whispers in his spirit finally broke him open. He bowed his head and prayed for the first time with sincerity, asking God to take his life and use it as he desired. That prayer was the beginning of a path Jonathan never could have predicted. The moment he surrendered, opportunities for ministry began opening one by one. He did not chase them, they found him. Small speaking invitations turned into larger gatherings. Conversations with friends turned into Bible studies. What started as a reluctant step became a steady walk into the very calling he once resisted. Looking back, Jonathan often said that God's calling is rarely straightforward. Sometimes it comes through silence, sometimes through storms, and sometimes through the quiet but undeniable protection over a person's life. For him, the strange way God called him was not about one dramatic sign, but about a series of mercies that all pointed in the same direction. Each escape, each word, each circumstance was like a thread, and together they wove the fabric of his testimony. The lesson from Jonathan's journey is one that speaks to anyone who has ever wondered about purpose. God's call does not always come with a trumpet or a blazing vision. Often it comes quietly, persistently, through the ordinary events of life that refuse to be ignored. Sometimes the very things we dismiss as coincidence are in fact the signposts of destiny. Jonathan's ministry would later impact countless people, but it all began with that tension between resistance and surrender. He learned that running from God only prolongs the process, and that what feels like losing control is actually finding true life. He often reminded others that no one is too far from God's reach. If God could take someone who doubted, resisted, and bargained, and then turn him into a messenger, then no one is beyond being called. Every preserved life, every unexplainable moment, may be pointing towards something greater. Jonathan's story is not just about a man becoming a minister. It is about God revealing that his plans are always deeper than our doubts. The calling may not arrive the way we expect, but it always arrives with purpose. Jonathan discovered that his escapes were not accidents. They were invitations. Invitations to step into the life he was created for, a life that could only be lived fully by answering the one who had been pursuing him all along. And so, his testimony stands as a reminder. Sometimes the most extraordinary callings come in the most unexpected ways. It is not about how ready we feel, but how willing we are to say yes when God makes it clear that he has preserved us for a reason. When Jonathan finally surrendered, he imagined that everything would suddenly become clear. He thought the moment he said, yes, to God, the path ahead would open like a straight road stretching into the horizon. Instead, what followed was more like a winding trail through unknown terrain. His heart was willing, but his steps were unsteady. The first challenge was learning to let go of his old life. Before surrendering, Jonathan had been chasing his own ambitions, dreams of success, recognition, and a life defined by his own terms. Walking away from that was not easy. Every time he tried to move forward, memories of his old pursuits whispered, tempting him back. But each time, he remembered the near accidents, in the preserved moments, the quiet voice reminding him that his life was not his own. He began spending more time in Scripture, not as a duty, but as a discovery. Verses that once seemed distant now leapt off the page. He saw himself in the stories of reluctant servants, Moses, who claimed he could not speak, Jonah, who ran in the opposite direction, Jeremiah, who felt too young. Jonathan realized that resistance was nothing new. God had a way of calling people who felt unqualified. Still, Jonathan's first steps into ministry were anything but smooth. When he was asked to share his testimony for the first time in a small group, fear nearly silenced him. He worried about stumbling over words or saying the wrong thing. Yet when he began to speak, something shifted. His nervousness gave way to a flow he could not explain. The very story he once wanted to hide became a bridge that connected him to others. He saw people nodding, some with tears in their eyes, because his story sounded like their own struggles. That night he realized that ministry was not about polished words or flawless delivery. It was about honesty, about opening wounds so others could see how God heals them. Soon, invitations began to multiply. Friends asked him to lead prayer gatherings. Neighbors wanted him to share what had changed in his life. None of it was grand, but each opportunity became a step forward. Jonathan saw that God was shaping him not in leaps but in steady, small movements. Yet, The strange hand of God's calling showed up again in ways he did not expect. One evening, as he walked home, he felt a nudge to take a different route than usual. He ignored it at first, but then felt it again, stronger. Reluctantly, he changed his path. Moments later, he came across a man sitting on the curb, broken and weeping. Jonathan hesitated, but something in his spirit told him this was not an accident. He sat down beside the stranger, listened to his story, and prayed with him. That night, the man gave his life to God. Jonathan walked home stunned, realizing that obedience in small things often leads to eternal outcomes. This became a pattern. Unexpected encounters, sudden opportunities, and divine appointments that Jonathan could never have orchestrated. Ministry was not something he had to build. It was something that unfolded as he listened and followed. But the journey was not without resistance. Some people questioned his sudden change. Old friends mocked him, saying it would not last. Others doubted his authority, reminding him of his past. These words stung, and at times Jonathan wondered if he truly belonged in ministry. But every time doubt crept in, God sent a reminder, a message from Scripture, a breakthrough in prayer, or the encouragement of a stranger reminded him that he was exactly where he was meant to be. One particular encounter cemented this truth. Jonathan had been invited to speak at a small gathering, but he almost backed out due to insecurity. That night, after reluctantly going through with it, a young man approached him afterward. With tears in his eyes, the young man said, "I was planning to give up on life tonight, but something you said reminded me that God still sees me." Jonathan walked away shaken. He realized that ministry was not about his ability, but about God's willingness to use even his weakness. Slowly, his ministry began to expand beyond his local circle. He found himself writing, sharing reflections, and even being invited to speak at larger events. With each step, he saw the same pattern. He did not push doors open, they simply opened before him. What surprised him most was how God used his earlier resistance as part of his message. People who struggled with doubt related to him, because he had once lived in that place. Those who felt unworthy found hope in his story, because he too had wrestled with feelings of inadequacy. In a way, his past became one of his greatest tools, showing others that God's call is not hindered by human weakness. One lesson Jonathan often repeated was this: God does not call the qualified. He qualifies the called. For him, this was not a cliché but a lived reality. Every new step revealed that what mattered most was not his strength but his surrender. As his influence grew, he remained mindful of the strange ways God had brought him this far. He often recalled those close escapes, those whispers in the night, those unplanned encounters. Each one had been part of the puzzle, pieces that only made sense once the bigger picture was revealed. By this stage, Jonathan had begun to see ministry not as a career, but as a continual response to God's call. It was not about building his name, but about serving wherever God placed him. Sometimes that meant speaking before a crowd, but other times it meant sitting quietly with one hurting soul. In both cases, the calling was the same: to be faithful. The early years of his ministry taught him that the path is rarely glamorous, often difficult, but always purposeful. It taught him that God's call is not about convenience, but about commitment. It reminded him that every preserved life, every second chance, carries weight, not just for the one preserved, but for all those who will be reached through that life. Jonathan's story in this season became a testimony that ministry begins not with certainty, but with willingness. Not with knowing every step, but with saying yes to the next one. And in that willingness, God's strange and beautiful plan begins to unfold. His testimony now spoke louder than any sermon. The God who pursues, who preserves, and who patiently waits is the same God who transforms doubt into destiny. And Jonathan was living proof of that truth.